Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. The first Battle of Bull Run is remembered as the first major engagement of the Civil War. The loss by Union forces ended any hopes that the conflict would be of a short duration, and it raised hopes by the citizens of the nascent Confederate States that they could win what many viewed as a second American Revolution. Bull Run is also remembered for the members of the U.S. Congress and other curious citizens who wandered out of Washington and headed to the area of Manassas, Virginia, on horseback and in carriages to see the battlefield drama play out in real time while enjoying a picnic. Well, when the army retreated, the politicians and others reportedly hastily jumped into their buggies or onto their horses and rode like the wind for the capital with the rest of their retreating army. That's what we've been led to understand. That's what's been largely reported. But we get a much different story from an eyewitness account by the man pictured here. He's a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Ohio's Albert Gallatin Riddle. He, with several of his comrades, pulled out revolvers and rifles and tried to stop the skedaddling Yankees from making it all the way back to the relative safety of the defenses of Washington, D.C. Riddle's account was published in a few newspapers, and it's filled with vivid details. I want to read it to you because it's quite fascinating. Mentioned are Generals Winfield Scott and Robert C. Schenck, U.S. Senators Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Zachariah Chandler of Michigan, and U.S. House of Representative members Harrison Blake and James Morris of Ohio, and George T. Brown, the Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. Senate. So imagine all these folks out with others on the battlefield in the wake of all the action, and you'll get the start of the story of Riddle about the battle. So this particular account by Riddle is dated Washington, Monday evening, July 24th, 1861, only 3 days after the battle. So here we go. Let's get into it. Although about 10 o'clock, I think I may as well commence giving you some detail of what I saw upon the battlefield. I shall attempt no account of the battle, for that was the strangest and most unaccountable transaction ever heard of, and it would seem as if our men, after beating the rebels, started and ran away from them and nearly destroyed our entire army. Mr. Blake and Mr. Morris of the House, Thomas Brown of the Ohio Farmer, it's a newspaper, and I started out about 4 o'clock yesterday morning with passes from General Scott to go to our army, whose headquarters were at Centerville, about 27 miles toward Manassas. We had baskets of provisions and a heavy armament of Navy revolvers, a carriage and driver, etc. After we had been at Centerville an hour or so, a heavy cannonading was commenced somewhere on the ground that our right occupied, Schenck and his brigade. At first, at intervals very long and about 3 miles from us, but although we were on very high ground that overlooked everything, the region was heavily wooded and we could see nothing but the smoke as it rose. We, although so near, could hear nothing of the details, and toward 4, we started with our carriage toward the battlefield, past an innumerable baggage train, then commencing to move, and so on. We began to meet soldiers and others coming back who told us that we had driven the enemy off. At 3 miles or so, we approached the ground where the battle had commenced under Schenck, opened by the Greys, who skirmished splendidly, as I was told. We finally came up to a farmhouse used as a temporary hospital where the wounded were brought in, and then we began to see the frightful marks of actual conflict. Beyond this was a wood half or three-quarters of a mile through, and it was posted the Second Ohio. The first were further on with Schenck and Sherman's battery. Our main army that had fought were still further on and on lower ground. We saw a group of prisoners taken by the Second Ohio. We understood our batteries, some of them, were just through these woods, and we went forward. The battle seemed over, and we had driven them. A few cannon were fired at intervals, one of which to our left seemed not very far off, which I supposed was one of ours. As we went forward, word reached us that just ahead and near the fire, two men were just killed by a cannonball. And I went forward and examined them and still did not suppose that they were killed by the gun nearest us, for I supposed that to be ours. They were New York men, badly mangled, and were just drawn near each other with their caps put over their faces. While at this point, I, several times, heard a huge, sharp rushing noise swiftly cut through the air, coming from the direction of the nearest gun, and began to think it was the enemy's battery cannonading that particular place. And so it was. But why it was left alone at that point, I did not know, nor do I now. I only know that the balls came nearer and nearer till one came that I thought must pass where Blake and I stood. It was just a few feet forward of us and struck just our right. Thinking we might have been seen and our little group made a special mark, we withdrew to a more sheltered point and soon after returning back toward the hospital near which was our carriage. We went back to the hospital, and looked upon the wounded, heard strange stories, and saw strange sights. We observed that the soldiers seemed drifting rather than marching in any order back toward Centerville, and I remembered that I saw Sherman's guns in the woods, limbered up and kneaded the same way. I also heard it several times remarked that the soldiers in the woods had been ordered back. Why? I knew not, but supposed for better through the night, perhaps for water. We began to think and feel that we had better return, but could not find one of our party, Morris. In fact, and waiting for him, we like to have been perpetual for us all. We finally found him, got into our carriage, and began to go back. Got just to the hospital when, sitting on the front seat and looking out to the south, I saw a body of dragoons dash around the corner of the woods and wheel and plunge down toward us. Just at this moment, a half dozen of our soldiers, moving on without orders or officers, rushed up to the fence to fire on them. I knew then that they were rebel cavalry. On they came to within 15 rods of us, perhaps. They drew up and delivered a rattling volley from their carbines among us, we being exactly in front. Whether they hit any of our folks, I know not. Our boys that I mentioned as running up to the fence returned the fire, and from their deliberation must have hit some of them. The rebels, after firing, wheeled and ran back the way they came. There were perhaps 40 of them, not more. Then the panic started. Just as the dragoons turned back, a cry was raised that the Black Horse, a formidable body of rebel cavalry, and these were part of them, were charging upon us. And it seemed as if the very devil of panic and cowardice seized every mortal soldier, officer, citizen, and teamster. No officer tried to rally the soldiers or do anything except to spring and run towards Centerville. There never was anything like it for causeless, sheer, absolute, absurd cowardice, or rather panic, on this miserable earth before. Off they went, one and all, off down the highway, over across fields, towards the woods, anywhere, everywhere to escape. Whether it communicated back to the soldiers in the woods and so on back to the regiments who had just driven off the rebels, I do not know. But think, it did to a part of them, for a share of our army seems to have been demoralized, if not broken up. Well, the further they ran, the more frightened they grew, and although we moved on as rapidly as we could, the fugitives passed us by scores. To enable them better to run, they threw away their blankets, knapsacks, canteens, and finally, muskets, cartridge boxes, and everything else. We called to them, tried to tell them there was no danger, called them to stop, implored them to stand. We called them cowards, denounced them in the most offensive terms, put our heavy revolvers and threatened to shoot them, but all in vain. A cruel, crazy, mad, hopeless panic possessed them and communicated to everybody about in front and rear. The teamsters all turned their heavy wagons and lashed their horses to a run and mixed and mingled with a crowd of running footmen, citizens, and horsemen, all raising an obscuring cloud of dust, and thus the tide filled the entire highway, a turnpike, with a heterogeneous mass of flying madmen intent upon nothing but escape. The heat was awful, although now, about 6, the men were exhausted. Their mouths gaped, their lips cracked and blackened with the cartridges they had bitten off in the battle, their eyes starting with frenzy. No mortal man ever saw a mass of ghastly wretches. As we came on, coming by the mass, unable to go ahead or pause or draw out of it, with the street blocked with flying wagons before and behind, thundering and crashing on, we were every moment exposed to the imminent danger of being upset or crushed or of breaking down. And for the first time on this strange day, I felt a little sinking of the heart and doubt whether we could avoid destruction in the immense throng about us. And nothing but the remarkable skill of our driver and the strength of our carriage and endurance of our horses saved us. Another source of peril constantly beset us. As we passed the poor demented, exhausted wretches who could not climb into the high, close baggage wagons, they made frantic efforts to get on to and into our carriage. They grasped it everywhere and got onto it, into it, over it, and implored us every way to take them on. We had to be rough with them. At first, they loaded us down almost to a standstill, and we had to push them off and throw them out. Finally, Brown and I, with a pistol each, kept them out, although one poor devil got in spite of us, and we lugged the infernal coward 2 miles. I finally opened the door, and he was tumbled out. A poor boy we brought all the way back to Centerville. The teamster seemed to grow more frightened, and the road was crowded with them. To lighten their wagons and increase their speed, they threw out everything: boxes and barrels, biscuit, crackers, ammunition of all kinds and quantities, bags of coffee, sacks of oats, spades, shovels, pickaxes, axes, and etc., and etc., in endless quantities and varieties, thrown and tumbled into the street and run 1,000 times over, and everything that could be was broken down and abandoned, baggage wagons overturned and left upright for miles and miles this side of Centerville. The other side of Centerville, we had overtaken Senators Wade and Chandler, or saw them in the crowd, the sergeant at arms of the Senate, and a Mr. Eaton of Detroit, with whom we were in company much of the way afterwards. Some 4 or 5 miles this side of Centerville, I observed their carriage, and then forward of us, are drawn up by the side of the road, and they jumped out with their rifles and revolvers as if they intended to make a stand against a stream of fugitives still running strong. Without waiting to stop or open a door, I seized a Navy revolver, called to our party, and sprang out also. Wade, that's Benjamin Wade, planted himself with a cocked Maynard rifle in the attitude of battle, Chandler with a revolver near him, and we placed ourselves, except Morris, by them, and all with loud voices commanding one and all to halt or have their brains blowed out. Our action instantly checked them. Many on horseback undertook to dash by, and we seized the bridle reins of their horses and compelled them to stop. They begged to be permitted to move on. One who had dispatches from General McDowell we permitted to go, of course, as also a servant of Colonel Peck and the commissary sergeant of the 2nd Wisconsin, who said they were looking for the baggage of that regiment and had not the appearance of fleeing. All the rest we stopped. Some of them presented weapons and threatened, and one, a teamster, shot Eaton through the wrist, who held his horse by the bridle. Just at this moment, a body of troops, the 2nd New Jersey, with its colonel at its head, came over a rise, and Morris, who saw them as he alighted, had gone on to urge them forward, came opportunely up. Otherwise, God knows what the result would have been. The whole thing occupied 5 or 10 minutes and was a scene of intense excitement and danger. 7 men staying a crowd, maddened and desperate with fear. Wade, firm and bold as an old lion. Chandler, frantically excited, and the rest of our band struggling, commanding, entreating, and threatening. As for me, I acted just as you know I would when thoroughly aroused, caring for nothing and nobody, and determined, as we all were, that the men should stop there. The 2nd New Jersey was quartered farther this way, and on hearing of the flight, its colonel had started towards Centerville with his regiment and now relieved us of our charge and gathered up and turned back the tide of runaways. His surgeon bound up Mr. Eaton's wound, and we moved on. Soon after, we took our stand. A fine-looking officer came up in the crowd, but who seemed not to have been a runaway, for he was cool, and asked what we were trying to do. I told him we were going to stop the shameful rout. Says he, "Give me your hand. I have tried to do it for a mile or two." And with his sword, he turned upon the runaways. This was near sundown and was the last incident of especial interest on our journey home, the whole of which continued full of interest. So there you have the eyewitness account of Albert Riddle from the United States Congress, Ohio representative, telling his story of what happened after the Battle of Bull Run, the ending part of Bull Run, and the retreat all the way back. Gives you a different picture of the runaway carriages and the horses and the role of these armed members of the United States Congress trying to stop the runaways from the Union Army. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.